When I drive out here, I'm thinking I'm going to be like one of 4 people. So this is cool. I appreciate you all coming out on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I was wondering if it was 70 and sunny out, if you'd all be doing something with your flowers or something. It's a pleasure to be here. I graduated from UMass Amherst. My PhD is from there in history. And I've taught history at UMass Lowell for, this is my 30th year. I lived many years in Northfield. I lived some years in South Deerfield, and I lived some years in Hadley on West Street. And I also lived in Holyoke, so I feel like I've been around here. Before I went to graduate school and got my PhD in history, I was a machinist for 15 years. I know it seems weird. At the American Bosch plant in Springfield, Massachusetts. Some of you who have been around would probably know of it. It was sort of on the Springfield-Chicopee line. It's not there anymore. It closed in 1986. And a few years after it closed, I went back to school. I had been in graduate school much earlier. I became a machinist because I had a house fire when I was living in South Deerfield as a grad student, and this was before computers and the cloud and all that stuff we have now. It was paper and a typewriter in the good olden days, and I lost everything. So I quit school. That's how I became a machinist. Because I had 2 small kids and I needed to work and make money. And a friend of mine worked there and said they're hiring and there's a training program, and I said, okay, sign me up. And then I ended up working there 15 years. It closed in 1986. And I ran a community economic development project in Springfield for several years, trying to figure out how to put out of work people like me back to work. And then my academic advisor at UMass Amherst, a historian by the name of Bruce Laurie, who some of you may have heard of. Anyway, he was still there after all those years, and he kept telling me to come back and finish. And so finally I said, okay. And I did. And I got hired at UMass Lowell. And I basically could not commute. Just having done the ride again reminded me of why I didn't want to commute. So I live in Lowell and I moved to Lowell. I've been working for a while, sort of a last book I have in me on an immigration history of Lowell, Massachusetts, which has a really incredibly diverse story. I'm trying to do it up to the present day. And there's a significant Polish immigrant presence in Lowell and Lawrence, in that area of Massachusetts, starting around the same time that the Polish community grows quite a bit here in Hadley. So I'm going to talk hopefully for about 40 minutes or so, and then leave enough time for questions and comments. I'm also perfectly happy if somebody says, yeah, that's not right. If the Spirit moves you and you need to raise your hand, raise your hand. If it's going to take me too far off topic, I'll say save it, which I do with my students when they want to go someplace I don't want to go. And then we'll come back to it at the end. I'm perfectly happy. Everybody can hear me okay? I'm trying to use my teacher voice even though it's Saturday. I usually rest my voice on Saturday, but so I'm going to sort of fit the Polish immigration story inside the larger immigration story, which I think helps to create a better way, I think anyway, to think about what's going on in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, when a wave of Polish immigrants make their way into the Connecticut River Valley. And I'm going to talk about why I think that happened, how that happened, what the impact of all that was. And then again, hopefully we have a good deal of time for people to ask questions, comment, share. You have probably, many of you in the room have a story You're itching to share about a great-grandparent or a great-great-grandparent or a parent even, depending on when people might have come. And that'll be wonderful as well. So typically, this would have been what traveling here would have looked like around 1900. Anybody coming from Europe, coming from ports where Polish immigrants would exit from, would have bought a steamship ticket. The steamship ticket probably cost around $10, which could have been a lot of money for people at the time. And the trip would have taken anywhere from a week and a half, 2 weeks, to maybe 3 weeks, depending on the weather. What you see here is not typical in the sense that most of the people and most Polish immigrants that came in the late 19th and early 20th century would have bought a ticket that was called steerage class, which basically meant that you were below deck for most of the trip. They kind of let you out for sun and watering once a day, and you got up onto the deck. But you basically paid the cheapest rate to come over, and you had the most difficult physical circumstance. You probably can imagine many people were seasick, which is an ugly thing, if any of you ever have been. All these people seasick below deck doesn't make for a pleasant journey. If you were wealthy, you basically got up on deck, you got a really nice stateroom, a suite, whatever they would have called it, and you had a really easy passage. And even when you got to Ellis Island, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes, you basically whisked through. It was like you had preferred status. You hardly were checked by anybody in immigration at Ellis Island or Boston if you came through Boston, and you sort of breezed your way through because you had money. And so there was a definite sort of pecking order, I guess you could say, of how people got in. If you were coming through Ellis Island, this picture was probably taken as people were pulling into and coming close to being able to see the New York City skyline. And the journey was just about over, and people were probably allowed to come up and basically see where they were heading. If you were on one of these really large vessels coming to Ellis Island, you didn't take this large vessel all the way to Ellis Island, if any of you have ever been there. How many people, by the way, have visited Ellis Island? Yeah, I would suspect that. That's well over half of you. This would have anchored someplace off the island, and then you would have basically been offloaded onto a variety of smaller vessels that would have basically docked at Ellis Island. A ship this size never could have gotten close enough to let people disembark. So they're probably either waiting to offload, or they're for joy that the trip is over. I can see Ellis Island. This is, the facts here are important. The earliest waves of immigration into the colonies and then into the early United States, there is no process of entry. People aren't being counted in any formal way. There's no green card, there's no visa, there's no paperwork at a consulate or an embassy. If you can get here, come on down. Lots of people are actually walking in from Canada, those Canadians. They're doing it again, right? On one side of my family is French Canadian, and they walked in. Again, there were no real serious border implementations of any kind until the 1920s. In the early 20th century, they start doing health checks and other things for people, which I'll talk about in a minute. But initially, there's not a lot of regulation. There's not a lot of rules. There's not a lot of expectations in terms of, can people read? Do people have any money? Can people work? Do people have any relatives here? Do they have a job? There's not a lot of that. That's going to come. But initially, and well, again, into like the 1880s, early 1890s, not a lot of rules. 1890s is when Ellis Island opens. And so again, up until that point, people kind of come and go. There's a lot of movement back and forth. Lots of people come with the expectation they're going to be here for a few years, make money. While they're here, send some money home to help take care of family they've left behind. And then their way of thinking about this is inevitably they're going to return home, be it Poland or another side of my family is from Italy. Nobody expected to stay here. They were going to make some money, work a while, and go back home again. That was the dream a lot of people had. Of course, depending on the circumstance, right? If you're coming from a war situation, if you're coming from a religious persecution situation, you're not thinking you're going back because there isn't anything to go back to. But if you're leaving from, as my grandparents did, from southern Italy, it's poor, but they're not under any, threats of physical violence or anything like that. Their anticipation was to go back. They didn't. But that's the story they told me when I was little. One thing I regret, the older I got, the more I studied history and thought about being a history teacher, the more I wished I had talked to my grandparents a lot more than I did. And I regret that now big time, right? The other day, one of my students asked me if I had a superpower, what would it be? And I said to basically time travel, which I think that would be what most historians would say. I'd love to be able to sit back down at a Sunday dinner table with my grandparents and say, now with what I know, ask them some good questions. Or take an oral history of their lives or something like that. And I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way. There's great value in collecting these stories. This is a favorite photo of mine just because of the kids. They're like great faces, right? So from 1880 to around World War I, the bulk of Eastern European immigrants are coming into the United States. Previous to this, the majority of people coming, not 100%, of course, always never 100%, but the majority of people coming into the United States between roughly 1870 and 1900 are coming from Western Europe. They're coming from France, they're coming from England, they're coming from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Germany. That's primarily where people are coming from. Starting around 1885, 1890, the flows of where people are coming from changed quite dramatically. And after that date, the overwhelming majority of people coming in are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that's when the Polish migration is at its peak, the late 1890s, the early 1900s. And so this is a photograph taken at Ellis Island. This is a photo in the Library of Congress, Polish immigrant boarding a ship. You can see the data here. 1880, Chicopee reports its first Polish settlers. Sunderland in 1885, Northampton 1886, Hatfield and Hadley 1890. Now that doesn't mean a few people weren't here before then, but particularly like 1890, that would have been the federal census, and when people were asked where they had come from. And so you can look at the Hadley census for 1890, and you can find people who basically say they came from Poland, and there's a place in the census for the language they speak. And if you look at that census data, most people are saying they speak Polish. So that's kind of a giveaway, right? As to where they came from. That, like if you were from Italy, you probably didn't say you spoke Polish. So again, around the same time, everybody's coming, everybody's arriving. Oh, I should say, I have a question. So I asked my students the other day, I was rehearsing this talk with them, seeing how it went over with young people. And I pointed out the trunk. And I said to them that if you came at this point in 1890, 1900, all you could take, if you were steerage class, is a trunk about that size. And so I asked them all what they would put in the trunk. So I'm asking you, we can take a minute detour here. So what would you put in the trunk? Anybody? One at a time, so it doesn't sound like I can't make any sense out of what you're saying. But somebody, go ahead, one person, and then go ahead, somebody, raise your hand. Yes. Photos. Okay, what else? Clothes.
Tools.
Silverware, what?
Tools.
Tools, okay.
They take weapons set up?
Seeds.
They could have had weapons. There wouldn't have been any check. There wasn't any TSA yet. And they didn't have to take their shoes off. Yes?
Rosary.
Rosary, okay. So some kind of a religious artifact. Maybe a family Bible that had a lot of names in it, or the first thing my students said, anybody want to guess? Cell phone. I said, come on, like, look at the trunk. They weren't, like, what are you thinking? But, yeah, I mean, eventually we got around to, one of the things that a lot of people took in the trunk, all the things that you mentioned were things that people took. People took coffee pots. There's a lot of photos of what's in the trunks and what people are carrying. Sometimes people carry the trunk and then there's like all these things tied to it. So they cheated a little bit, right? And it's like, it's a coffee pot. And I imagine that, right? Because I don't know about you, but I have a coffee pot that I love. And I got to have coffee first thing in the morning from that pot. And if I don't, I'm all off. Go ahead.
I have a friend whose family came and they brought a bread starter.
Yep. Yeah, something that connects, right? So what a lot of people brought was, pardon? A bread starter.
Sourdough.
Yeah, like a sourdough bread thing, right? Yep. So what a lot of people brought were articles of clothing representative of their culture, which I find really interesting. In reading up on almost all groups, you can find this in the evidence that we have. But what was fascinating was they put them in the trunk. They did not wear them on the passage. But when they got in sight of Ellis Island and they were going to get off and go through, they put them on. So you see, depending on the photos that you look at, the Library of Congress is loaded with photos of people coming through Ellis Island. And my students, when I show them, they say, well, why are they wearing that? Whatever. And I'll say, that's typical of like a shawl for covering somebody's head, or a certain kind of belt, or a tunic, or whatever it would be. But basically people want to be proud and want to represent, right? When they go through the line at Ellis Island. And so they get out those things, and then they have them, right? Forever and ever. Like when they're here in Hadley and there's a Polish feast day or a church celebration or whatever it would be, on come those things that they brought with them from Eastern Europe. And that's a reminder of who they are, of their identity. And it's a pretty powerful symbol. The rosary, I like the rosary bead one too. I'm sure my Italian grandmother probably brought rosary beads. Again, now I wish I could ask her. I can't, right? So here's again sort of, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at this. I'm not going to belabor the slides, but there's a huge demand in America in the 1880s, 1890s for workers. The United States is going through a massive industrial revolution. We are becoming the most powerful manufacturing economy in the world by 1900. So there's an explosion of manufacturing jobs. Pittsburgh making steel, eventually all around the Great Lakes making automobiles, farm equipment, you name it, bicycles, motorcycles, all these commodities. And workers are badly needed to fill all of these jobs. Meatpacking. Significant numbers of Polish immigrants end up in Chicago, working in the meatpacking industry. Huge numbers of Polish immigrants end up in Pittsburgh, working in the steel industry. So a lot of workers, a lot of Polish immigrants end up as industrial workers, as factory workers. If any of you remember in your school days, you might have read the novel The Jungle. That's about Polish immigrants by and large. And so if you haven't read it, now you should be inspired to check. It's a thick book, but you can handle it. So a lot of people initially are going to come from Poland, they're going to get to Ellis Island, and they might have a relative or somebody in the industrial belt in the middle of the country, and off they go. Significant numbers of people come this way too, end up in Chicopee, Pittsfield, Holyoke. There's a large Polish population in Holyoke working in the mills in Holyoke. And so initially lots of people are doing factory work. Here in Hadley it's a bit different. We'll see, the story is that most people that end up here ultimately become farmers. They buy land. They might work in Chicopee for a while, or Pittsfield, or North Adams, or someplace like that, save their money, and then buy a small plot of land and become a farmer, and basically dot the valley, not just here, but other places around here as well. So not everybody ends up in industry, not everybody ends up in agriculture. People arriving from Ukraine, Lithuania, other parts of Eastern Europe are going to be referred to a lot in the immigration history as Polanders. Poland is a loosely sort of defined country for a long time in this period. There are Polish people living in various places in Eastern Europe, in various countries. And so how we arrive, historians arrive at a number, doesn't always work. So this is a typical way people would sort of categorize groups of people coming in. This photo is in the Holyoke History Room. This is the family gave lots of photographs to the Holyoke Public Library. If you have lots of photos in your family, and there have to be many historical societies around here. There's a Polish Historical Society as well. Donate those photos, don't throw them away. They'll scan them and give the originals back to you, but then next time I give a talk, your family can be in the talk because we have a photo. What's interesting about these photos, in doing the research in Lowell, I'm sure it's the same here, I'm sure it's the same with this photo. A lot of these photos get turned into postcards, and when people get here, after they've been here 6 months or a year, they send a postcard back. Wish you were here, right? And they talk about how well they're doing. Whether they're doing well or not. They talk about how well they're doing. And in the research that I've done in Lowell, I haven't done this, say, in Holyoke or Springfield, but again, it can't be that different. There are photo studios where you can go and you rent the outfits. And you rent the backdrop. It's kind of like when your kids were little and you took them to Sears or something for a Santa photo, right? And it looks like, wow, it's magical. Same deal. And so I came onto this because I was looking at all these photos and I was thinking, all these kids have sailor suits on. What's the deal with sailor suits? And a friend of mine in Lowell, who studied this more than I, said that's not their clothes. They're a rental. It's like renting a tux to the prom. And you look really spiffy, but it's not yours. And so I don't want to cast aspersions on this family and say they didn't do really well. This could be their clothing. So I don't want anybody to say like I'm talking down about this family. But on the other hand, the odds are great. And again, because once you're here, you don't want to write home, yeah, it sucks. You've left in a blaze of glory. You're going to go make your fortune in America. And now it's not turned out the way it's supposed to be, so you're not going to write home, yeah, it's really terrible. At least I don't think so. I mean, some people probably did, but in general, you would do this. And so in a lot of historical societies, there are these collections of postcards. And they're great when they're saved and they've been written on the back, because then you can see like the notes of what people wrote home. And again, it's a really powerful resource for people to have. When you got to Ellis Island, this is what it looked like. So now this room doesn't look like this. If you've been to Ellis Island recently, this was known then as the main hall or the Great Hall. And this is where people would have been waiting to be processed. It kind of looks like an airport, waiting in line, right? The people are waiting to basically have a health check, physical check. You can see in all these photos the white tags. Basically, people have like a batch number when they get off. They have a number that says where they came from. Sometimes it would, depending, have on it the ship that they came from, how old they were, their family name. It would have basic information. And then that would be used as people work their way through the line. This is another photo from Ellis Island, and we know from the photographer that these are young Polish women coming through. And again, they don't have, in this instance, a trunk. Basically, they have their things in a, I don't know what you would call it, a valise of some sort, or a satchel, or cloth bag of some kind. Not as sturdy, obviously, as a trunk. And they're waiting to be processed. If this is somebody's grandmother, raise your hand. Every once in a while when I do something like this in some place with a photo, somebody says, wait, like that's my aunt. And it's like, okay, that's always a wonderful thing. Another photo at Ellis Island. And whenever I look at this, I think the poor mom. This is another Polish family. By the late 1890s, people were barred from admission if they were suffering from what the law said was a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease. And basically they would check people for such a thing. Also, they would basically not want to let anybody in convicted of a misdemeanor involving moral turpitude. That means you're a sex offender, basically, in modern day language. Now, I don't know how they would know that. Because if you asked me, and I knew that it would be disqualifying, are you a sex offender? Yeah, no. By the way, I'm not. Or I wouldn't be I couldn't get in the library, right? But this started to be the beginnings of sorting mechanisms, right? And so what happened was Congress became involved in actually studying immigration to try to come up with a system. And by the early 1900s, Congress set up a study commission called the Dillingham Commission. It was named after a senator from Vermont by the name of John Dillingham. And they basically undertook a massive study of immigration and the impact of immigration on communities, on jobs, on wages, on health. They did basically, there's almost a 40-volume set of like this incredibly rigorous research, which is an amazing tool for historians because it captures all this data. They did house-to-house surveys in several different cities. There's one they did in Lawrence in 1911, which I've used a lot. They went door to door in Lawrence and basically recorded all this information on what people did for work, whether they had learned English or not, whether their kids were in school, all sorts of things, which is really incredible. And so Congress started creating laws to bar admission for certain types of things. Again, here's the beginnings of that. And what was happening was the shipping companies, the shipping lines from Europe, would pack their ship. Anybody that wanted to buy a ticket would buy a ticket. So people who were infirm in some way, people who were physically disabled, couldn't work. Technically, the United States would not let them in because they were thought of as being a ward of the state. That's what they would have been referred to as. They were not allowed to come in, but the shipping companies would put all those folks on the ships anyway. If you had the money to buy the $10, they sold you a ticket one way. This is the rub. And then when they got here, if they were excluded, they had to go back, and then the federal government would buy the return ticket. So now the shipping line, if in every ship there were 30 or 40 people that had to be brought back, basically Uncle Sam bought the tickets to put the 40 people back on the ship they had just come over on to go back wherever they were going to go. And finally Congress said, wait a minute, if this has to stop, when you're on the shipping line, if you sell them a ticket and we stop them from coming in for all these reasons that I'm starting to enumerate, you have to basically pay to bring them back. We're not buying that ticket anymore. And so that basically pushed the screening process, if you follow, back on the country that people were leaving from, right? And so again, these are the, I'm getting closer to people coming to Hadley, don't worry, fear not, we're getting there. At Ellis Island, if you were Polish or Italian or whatever, basically starting again in the late 1890s, there would be a physical checkup. It would be really quick, sometimes 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 45 seconds. When you were in the Great Hall, the slide 4 or 5 back, and you were in that room, there were people, there was an observation deck, and people in the observation deck would be looking down to see if anybody was limping. If anybody, when they got up, was like, oh, my back, whatever, right? They basically would start to then point people out, again, because they're people that would then be checked more. They couldn't do a detailed exam of everybody. They didn't have enough physicians and nurses and people to handle on any given day. There could be several thousand people waiting to be processed. And so they couldn't do, like a regular physical on everybody. So that was sort of the sorting mechanism. This is a kid being looked at. It happened occasionally, not a lot, but occasionally a child could be coming through with measles or scarlet fever or something contagious, and they wouldn't be sent back. They built a kid hospital on Ellis Island, and they would put the kids in the kid hospital. And provided then the mom or dad or whomever was with the kid was cleared to go through, they would stay in New York City. They could come out back and forth every day to Ellis Island to visit their kids until their kids were okay. And then their kids would be let off the island with their mom or their dad. But they wouldn't, they wouldn't send a kid back because they were ill. There was a hospital that took care of them. One of the big things they were looking at were eye infections, because there were eye infections at the time that were highly contagious and could cause blindness. And so they really wanted to check people very, very carefully. Again, wherever you were coming from, you can see this is an eye inspection right there. You can see if you notice the person flying open somebody's eye, what might you notice? It might be harder in the back, but in the front, yeah.
he doesn't have any gloves on, no protection gear.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if you're coming, and this is, it's funny, not funny. If you're coming through and they flip up your eyelid and you're infected, he does not go and wash his hands. He flips up the eyelid of the next person. And the other way this got done is with a button hook. And so they would put it under your eyelid and flip your eyelid back. Same way. Just use it again. And so one wonders how many people ended up becoming more ill. But again, you can see the line and how quickly this has to happen, right? They're not doing something where he's taking gloves, you know, for each person, he puts a new pair of gloves on. Yeah, no, we're not there, we're way not there yet. These are the marks they would put on people when they were health checked. So they would actually, on your clothing, put these marks. And that would essentially, so trachoma, CT, that was the eye disease. And so they would, if you were coming along, they would put one of these things, so neck, meaning maybe this person can't work, there's something wrong with their neck or their back or whatever it would be. Oftentimes this would, if you had these marks on you, it would mean a further, you might be pulled out of line and checked even more. It could also be disqualifying. What started to happen, and my students think this is cool, what started to happen is people realized, like as you're going through the line, they're putting these marks on you, and initially people don't necessarily know, right? But by word of mouth and over the years, people begin to tell other people, like in a postcard or whatever, if you're coming and they put a CT on you, like erase it. So people start smudging out or turning their jacket inside out. So if I'm going through with this and I'm covered with chalk, before I get to the end, I just put my jacket inside out, hope nobody sees me, and try to figure out a way to get through that way. So there's no way of knowing how many people might have done this, but we know that people did do it. And that makes sense to me. If you're fleeing a really difficult situation, you're fleeing a war or religious persecution or the possibility of draft into the military, whatever it might be, and you get here and you know that like a H stands between you and getting to Ellis Island and disappearing somewhere into the middle of the country, you're going to erase that. I suspect most people would erase the line. But again, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, really quick. Then there's this. I have a former student now who works at Ellis Island as a national park tour guide. Fortunately, he hasn't been fired yet. And one of the things he does is talk about this staircase. So once people are processed, you're basically either you're going to go down one or the other of these staircases. One takes you to a part of Ellis Island where if you're fortunate to have currency, you can change it into US currency. So if you have lira with you or whatever you might have with you. Another one is basically you're free to go. You go down that staircase and out the door. And the other one basically means you're going back, right? And so the staircase, basically that's why it's called the stairs of separation. And I can't imagine, again, how people process all that as you're being bustled and hustled through. You've just spent 2 weeks on a ship, and 7 or 8 minutes being handled, and now it's like go this way, that way, or the other way. But in all, only about, so with all of these processes still, only around 3.5% to 4% of people were sent back, which is not a lot. I mean, if you think about in between 1900 and 1914, about 1 million people came through Ellis Island a year. And only about 4% of those people were denied entry. So even though, again, there's a screening process and whatnot, I don't think that by and large, obviously there's exceptions, but by and large, people are not going out of their way to try to disqualify people if that many people get through, at least the way I think about these processes. This, my student sent me, I didn't even know about this, and he said, you know about the kissing post? And I said, no. He said, oh yeah, this is this cool sign in Ellis Island. I'll read it because it might be hard to read from where you are. The kissing post. In this area, immigrants were reunited with waiting friends and relatives who had preceded them to America. The emotional and joyous scenes that took place here prompted an Ellis Island matron to write the following in 1910, quote, "The manner in which the people of different nationalities greet each other after a separation of years is one of the interesting studies at the island. The Italian kisses his little children but scarcely speaks to his wife, never embraces or kisses her in public. The Hungarian and the Slavish people put their arms around one another and weep. The Jew of all countries kisses his wife and children as though he had all the kisses in the world and intended to use them all up quick." I just find that really cool. I'm hearing something.
Turn right onto Gough Street.
Oh. I'm leaving.
At the stop sign, turn left onto Middle Street. In 3/4 of a mile,
Stop.
turn right onto Rocky Hill Road.
I don't want you. I could hear somebody telling me to go on Rocky Hill Road, and I'm thinking, wait, what the hell? That's a first for me. I should say, by the way, on the way here I got stopped in New Salem for speeding. On Route 202. I probably was going like 8 miles over the speed limit, but it's hard when there's no traffic. The speed limit at one place was 35, right at New Salem. And you know, all of a sudden behind me, I see this cruiser. And I knew, I mean, and so pulled me over, rolled down the window, license and registration, blah, blah, blah. Then he says, when was the last time you were stopped for a traffic violation? I said, 40 years ago, which is true, 40 years ago. And he said, well, you know I can check. And I said, check, 40 years ago. Went to the cruiser, came back and said, I'm giving you a warning. And that was that. And so I thought my 40 years got me something. My 40 years of luck got me something. It was very, I mean, it was very nice. The whole thing was, you know, and I said, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And all I was doing in my brain was calculating the surcharges on my car insurance for the next 3 years and all those points I would lose and like, and no, but it's true, it was 40 years ago on the Mass Pike. But, so yeah, anyway, I decided I'm not going home that way. So I can cancel that entirely. All right, so now we get to Hadley. So how do people find their way here? I didn't know this question I didn't know the answer to this question until I was asked to do this. I had given a talk in the fall in Holyoke and talked about Holyoke and Polish community in Holyoke and at the Holyoke Public Library, right? But I hadn't studied Hadley specifically. So this is good. So now I did. I did some homework. And I lived on West Street in Hadley, so when I found this photo, I thought, well, I'll use this photo. I don't know if that was the house I lived in. It was basically, it was owned by somebody in Hadley and they were renting it to students. There used to be a garage that fixed cars, Seb's Auto, whatever it is. I think as I recall, he might have been the owner of the house. But I know I used to get my car fixed there. Is it still there? Probably not. But it was on Route 9. I remember that. Anyway, so I lived somewhere in the neighborhood. And actually one summer I planted onion sets in Hadley and also in Hatfield and harvested squash and pumpkins and Hubbard squash, and that's a miserable job. But as a college student I needed money. So as Polish immigration is growing into the United States, it comes at a fortuitous time, a lucky time, a good time for farmers who are here, because, amongst other things, a lot of their kids don't want to be farmers. They're leaving. They're going to Boston. They're going to New York. They're not staying in Hadley. And so farm labor is there's getting to be a shortage of farm laborers. And in Hadley, one of the consequences of that is to keep farm labor, you have to pay people quite a bit more money than other places in the country where people can make a living doing farming. And so typically the wage would be $20 a month. In Hadley, it balloons up to $30. And that's problematic for farmers. And so wages are going to go up, and that's going to begin to draw Polish immigrants, especially Polish immigrants from rural parts of Europe, people with farm skills, experience working on farms, and they're going to slowly begin to come up the Connecticut River Valley, right? All the way, like from below, from southern Connecticut, all the way up through, right? And that's the beginning of an influx of Polish immigrants into this area. And this I found fascinating, and I didn't know about this until I started doing this work, so I'm grateful for the invitation, even though the ticket, I would have cursed you all each time I paid the surcharge on my insurance. But what started happening is essentially there would be people from the area who would go to Ellis Island and lurk. Hey, I know where you can get a job. Come with me, bud. And people would grab up this guy, Charles Parsons. There's newspaper articles about him. He's the most infamous of this crew that would, primarily from Northampton, go to Ellis Island on a regular basis and bring wagon loads of people back to Hadley, and back to Hatfield, and back to Deerfield, basically to do agricultural labor. And we know about him because he's ultimately arrested for doing what he's doing. That now we would call that trafficking. I don't know if that was necessarily a word they would have had for it back then, but there are accounts I read where it's claimed that he and others would actually chain people up in a barn when they brought them up here until such time as they could find a place to put them. And then if you were a farmer and you got that labor, basically you paid him. That's how he made his money. You paid him for bringing people, and then you, the farmer, would deduct over time the money that you had paid him from the wages of the people that were working for you. And that was a not unusual routine. Everybody follow? That's like, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking I'm confusing myself. But everybody follow? So again, this was a fairly typical situation. This is more on Parsons. This is from a study that someone had done in the 1930s on farming in Hadley. In 1885, Mr. Charles Parsons of Northampton made his first trip to New York, returned with a group of Polish immigrants to be sold to the farmers of Hadley and the surrounding towns. The word sold is proper because each farmer paid the agent their first month's wages as a fee. And then I found an oral history that was done with Walter Kalnacki. Is that how you pronounce it? Kalnacki? Give me a shot here. Say it again? Koznoski. Kovnowski. Okay. Walter Kovnowski, born in Hatfield in 1929, in the oral history described how his father had worked for a Hatfield farmer who had sponsored the journey across the Atlantic. 2 years to pay off the debt a little at a time. This is a fairly recent oral history, done in 2022. So again, the more I poked around, like at first when I saw one account, I said, well, this seems far-fetched. Then I kept finding other things, and I thought, okay, it's not far-fetched. It actually happened. But fairly quickly, people start buying up farmland. 20% of the population in Hadley owned 700 acres, 5.3% of the land. By 1929, 60% of the population, 40% of the land. So what happened is that as a small community set itself up here, working primarily as farm laborers, over time, as farmers, Yankee farmers who basically were farmed out, right? They aged out of being a farmer, which is a really difficult thing to do. And lots of farms in this area were abandoned. The research on the numbers of abandoned farms and basically abandoned acreage is quite extraordinary when I was reading it, like how much land nobody was doing anything with. Again, because young people left, and historically in the United States, farms were passed down, right, generation to generation. But if your children don't want to do it, what happens, right? And so, slowly but surely, ownership of the land here begins to really dramatically shift to immigrants, and in particular, in this area that we're in this afternoon, Polish immigrants. Many of the best farmers in the Connecticut River Valley are immigrants from Poland. Some of the best farms are owned by them. If the movement goes on, the farms of New England will come to be owned largely by the Poles, for the native-born stock continue to gravitate to the city. This is from the Greenfield Gazette in 1912. And again, this is, for an historian, you like to show people your evidence. So you can't say I made it up. It's not fake news. On the whole, the writer thinks the many Poles will be a benefit to the people in those towns financially, and the children who are now attending our primary schools will make good citizens. What should we do for help is asked by our farmers if it were not for the Poles. So you could, as one historian has done, you could make a plausible argument that the agriculture that's still here was largely saved by the fact that Polish immigrants came here. And people basically, for Hadley, talk about asparagus and onions as like the two things. There's one article that I actually read just the other day about an asparagus festival in Hadley back in, I think it was 1931 or 1932. And they talked about how everybody was competing for the best asparagus. And they were all wrapping the stalks up so they would stand up with a really great ribbon and everything. And there were judges that were which one is the greenest and the crunchiest. There were all these categories of how to rank the, and I must admit, I mean, I like asparagus, but it's not something I would go wild over. But I could see what, I mean, here, basically, apparently the soil, everything about this area was great for onions, potatoes, and asparagus, and also tobacco, right? A little bit further up. So again, a lot of people came into the valley. This is one example of a factory where people work, Polish immigrants, a sewing machine company that in Orange, Mass, that made a huge amount of sewing machines on an annual basis. People took those jobs to save money, to then be able to buy land and eventually, hopefully, buy a farm. And that was, again, a fairly typical route that people would have taken. I think this definitely is onion harvesting. I can tell by them all on the ground there. And again, this would be something young kids could do. Women would obviously do this kind of work. You can see the photograph. This is another photo in the Library of Congress. It just basically said it was in the Connecticut River Valley. It didn't actually say where, so I'll assume it's Hadley. I'll use poetic license. It kind of looks like the range there, doesn't it? Looks like, what is it? What's that Mount whatever? Mount, no, where am I? That way. I saw them when I was, yeah, Skinner, yeah. Where the trolley used to go up. Yeah. This is a Hadley photo.
How do you know?
Because it came from a book about Hadley Farms and Hadley farmers. And that's a good question. Test my veracity. It's okay. It's cool. I did plant onion sets one summer in Hatfield on my hands and knees.
What farm?
I forget the name of it actually, but it was right near the center of town. Although there are quite a few. That probably, you're probably thinking, yeah, there are a lot of them. But yeah.
Polish farmer or Yankee farmer?
Polish. Yep. He kept yelling at me to go faster. This is Hatfield. How do I know? Because it says so. That could have been me, only I wasn't around in 1936. So, the story takes a turn. And I want to do a little bit of that, and then I'm looking at the time, I will be done, because I promised we would have time to chat. By 1915, 1916, right around the time that we're going to be thinking about entering World War I, the country takes a turn decidedly against immigration. So the study that I mentioned before, the Dillingham Commission, that study has been completed, and there is a big clamoring to stop immigration. And the arguments range over a variety of reasons. One is that there's not enough room. The country's full. That's one argument that people make. The country's full. A second argument that people make is that the immigrants who are now coming from Southern and Eastern Europe basically can't assimilate. They basically don't have the mental capacity to become Americans. And if we let them continue to come in, it will degrade the country. So this becomes a much darker kind of a argument that people make, and we'll see how this progresses. But again, this is the Ellis Island photo. And this is a period when people are very much caught up in what is a junk science of eugenics, which essentially attributes certain mental capabilities to different nationalities and also proclivities to crime. So if you're from Italy, you're more likely as not to stab people. This would be in a eugenics textbook if it was being used. And because I'm half Italian, I can make that. I can state that safely. It's not true, but these would be the arguments that people would make. And so in Greenfield and in the valley, people begin to sort of waver, right? So I just read you the Greenfield newspaper article about where would we be without Polish immigrants, but here's from the same newspaper. If we are to surrender our birthrights to those we have considered our inferiors on all points of civilized development, it will be a serious anticlimax to the ambitious purpose with which New England began. Isn't it time for men of brains and capital set about reclaiming their own and not leave some of our choicest possessions to be acquired for the occupation almost by the ignorant victims of European oppression? So these are two fascinatingly different perspectives from inside the same newspaper in roughly the same time period. One saying, where would the farms be in the valley without Polish immigration? And another one saying, oh man, if we're not careful, country's going to take a turn for the worse. And this is the debate inside America in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Saturday Evening Post, which probably many of you are like my family. My family got the Saturday Evening Post. I eagerly look forward to the Norman Rockwell covers as a kid. But anyway, from the Saturday Evening Post, if the farmer doesn't keep out the weeds by his own toil, his crops will be choked and stunted. If America doesn't keep out the queer, alien, mongrelized people of southeastern Europe, her crop of citizens will eventually be dwarfed and mongrelized in turn. So this is an unpleasant conversation we're having with ourselves in this period of time. This is a photo of immigrant kids in Lawrence, by the way.
In where? Lawrence. In where?
Say it again.
Where is it?
That's a photo in Lawrence, Mass. So by 1924, the debate gets settled, and the country passes a seriously limiting piece of legislation that's targeted to keep out people coming to the US from Southern and Eastern Europe. It's explicitly designed to make it exceedingly difficult for any sizable number of people to come from Southern and Eastern Europe, and I'll show you why in a second. But again, this is 1924. So it's only then, in 1924, that a system is put in place to require visas. Up until that point, if you can buy a ticket and you can get through the physical check we talked about, you can come in. Now the quota system that's going to be put in place limits how many people can come in by a very specific number, and I'll show you what the numbers are in a second. And you basically have to go to an embassy or US embassy or consulate and get documentation. And when the numbers of people fill up the quota, that's it. Nobody else in that calendar year is allowed to come into the United States. And so this is a chart of how, so Polish immigration is capped at 6,000 people annually. If you look at the way to understand what's here. Italy, 4,000, Czechoslovakia, 3,000, all the way down to Lithuania, 344, Latvia, 142, Spain, 131. And look on the other side, like Germany, 51,000, Great Britain, 34,000. And so what they did, they were very clever. They didn't want to say that the law was targeting Southern and Eastern European immigrants. So they basically said, it's just math. And what they did is they said, we're going to take 1890 and people can come in, the number of people can come in based on the number of people in the census that were already here from that country. 3% of that number can come into the US on an annual basis. The trick was that the majority of Southern and Eastern European immigrants came after 1890, so they picked a date that basically shrank the numbers of people who could come in. Hopefully that makes sense. Everybody follow? So what they didn't want, they're politicians. What they didn't want to do is alienate the immigrant vote, second generation especially, in all the cities where people's relatives would be impacted. So it's just math. It's fair. It's the same for everybody. If they picked 1900, the numbers on the column on the right, all of those would have doubled or tripled. Because it's between 1890 and 1900 that you get this surge, right? So you can see, they got what they wanted. They wanted immigration, they wanted it to shrink, and then they also wanted it to come only from certain places. And so basically almost 87% of all the immigration is going to come from Western Europe, which is what they wanted, but they couldn't say, we want to make a law that only says Western Europeans can come. that would upset a lot of people and potentially cost somebody, particularly in cities where most immigrants are living. But you can see what happens. And then if you're from these other, like from Africa, basically 1,000 people from Africa total. Australia, 121. Syria, 100. Turkey, 100. Egypt, 100. And so this stayed on the books until the 1960s. This was the immigration policy of the country from 1925 when it was implemented until the 1960s. And when John F. Kennedy was president, before he was assassinated, he called for an overhaul of the immigration process. And after he died, Lyndon Johnson decided one of the legacies to Kennedy would be to push through immigration reform, and that's what happened. And so the quota system was eliminated. And some other things occurred as well, but too far afield to go into. So Polish immigrants definitely upset. Polish American newspaper, if the Americans wish to have more Germans and fewer Slavs, why don't they admit that publicly? So people pushed back, but it didn't change anything. The law basically became the law of the land. What happened subsequently is a story of immigration history that doesn't often get told. And so I'm finishing with this slide. The numbers are difficult to read, maybe. But essentially what I'm showing you is the numbers of people who emigrated to the US between 1908 and 1925, and then the numbers of people after they got here who returned from whence they came. And it's an interesting, so from Poland, about 25% of everybody that came returned over that period of time. From Portugal, 60%, Romania, 31%, Russia, 52%. So you can see high percentages of people. When I was a kid and was taught immigration history, I never was taught that that many people left, right? Basically the way, at least it was taught to me, was people got here, they got off the boat, they went through Ellis Island, they fell down and kissed the ground, and they lived happily ever after. That was kind of like the story that I was taught in elementary school and junior high. When I first came across this book and this table, it was like, wait, this is crazy. And so,
Driving force was for that?
pardon me?
What was the driving force for people going home? You know?
Some of it was people were just unhappy here. There were a variety of reasons in the book. He basically explains. So some people just never were quite successful. Other people never intended to stay in the first place. Other people got discouraged by the prejudice they felt against them and went back for all of those reasons. So it wasn't any specific thing, one thing, combination of several, right? What's interesting is in the book, it's very strange because he talks about how he has this table and he says in an odd way, and it took me a while to get my brain around it. He says in an odd way, this coming and going helped the US win World War II. And I thought, what? And he said, yeah, so many villages that people went into throughout Europe, there were all these people that could speak English. And as the US troops came in, they were happy to see the US troops and said, yeah, the Germans are like right around the corner. They're right over there. And get ready, because they're like right behind that wall, waiting for you, right? And that he does it way more elegantly than I just did. But it made sense to me. At first I'm thinking, what do you mean? But then when I thought about it, yeah, that made sense, right? That interaction was really sort of an instrumental instrumental thing. This is the last slide. This is Polish immigrant family again, Ellis Island National Park photo. This shows sort of to think about conversations we're having now about immigration, sort of the percentages of foreign-born as a total of the US population over that time from 1890 to 2020, to the last census. And so 14.7% in 1890, the quota system, once it goes in place, I mean, that's the legacy. The last big immigration reform comes with Ronald Reagan. And we don't think of Ronald Reagan and Republicans as necessarily immigration reformers, but actually Reagan does quite a bit to reform immigration law and to open the country, particularly to Central America, South America, and Asian countries. And also Reagan puts a really big emphasis on family reunifications. And so then that's basically what accounts for this jump in the more recent period is those reforms that were done. And we really haven't had a decent conversation and an effort at immigration reform since President Reagan. So we're talking about 40 years. Yeah, about 40 years. It's probably time. But anyway, I will stop there. Thank you for listening. So, thoughts, ideas, questions. Hopefully you found out something today you didn't know before. So it wasn't a complete bust of a Saturday afternoon. But I'm interested in any questions or comments people have, please. Yes?
Prejudices. Back in 1917, my mother told me that her parents and the rest of the Polish community in Hatfield built their own church because they could not attend the Irish Roman Catholic church in town. They had to go into the basement or go to Northampton and travel, and they can finally put the money together. So,
Yeah, I think that's.
But again, new technology, people wanted a more modernistic church, decided to build a new church. A lot of conflict there. The new church was built.
Yep.
In the meantime, asked to use that church again. Same scenario. Maybe a year or two under construction. They were not allowed to use the church again. They went to one of the first churches in town, the first Congregational church. Their community opened their house of worship to the Polish community. And I have members of my town here that remember that. I know my grandfather was very, very, how can you say it, moved by the comfort of the cushioned seats that they had. Honest, he said, very soft.
Yeah.
Nice.
I used to look for the thickest kneelers at St. Mary's Catholic Church in downtown Beverly, which I would look and see. Like if I'm going to be down, I want like good padding. Other thoughts, questions, comments, anything? Yes.
Yeah, I went to Poland, and my grandparents were born in Białystok, and I loved it out there. And my last name is Generalchuk, but the
Generalchuk.
short
How'd I do?
Generalchuk,
Generalchuk.
but they shortened it to General. So my father was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
So they
Okay,
had
hurry up, General.
that name.
Yeah.
So
That's good.
He got to the rank of Sergeant Major, so he was a Sergeant Major General.
Yeah, that's good. That's
So
good.
the troop said, hey, you gotta watch it. There's
Uh-huh.
a Sergeant Major General inspecting the troop. And he says, One soldier said to the other, is that even a rank?
Interesting. When my grandfather came through Ellis Island, his last name was Sambrano, Ciambrano, and when he went through, he became Brown. And so I went to Ellis Island and found the ship's records, the manifest and everything, and basically I was struggling over trying to find like any documentation of him ever leaving Ellis Island, because I know he did, and I asked one of the archivists there, and they basically compared the two lists and said, oh yeah, here he is. Francisco Sambrano became Frank Brown. And he went to Philadelphia and immediately became Francisco Sambrano again in Philadelphia. But that happened a lot. And so I was really befuddled with trying to, I wanted to have, if you go and find people, you can actually then find a photograph of the ship they came on, right? You can really do a lot of research. And I was just stumbling, and like she came over and said, what's the trouble? I said, my grandfather's disappeared. She said, no, I'll find it. But she obviously did this for a living and sort of knew and said, yeah, that was, colors became favorite last names. Lots of people became Green or Brown. Yeah, so I'm not Purple. I don't know too many people with the last name Purple. Yes?
I just have an interesting story about being little. My father and his whole family, mother and father, came here from Poland. Her mother came here first, like you said, and was sending money back to my grandmother's father so that they could save up to come back here. And my grandmother's father was taking the money and drinking with them. My grandmother take care of everybody, and my grandmother thought, how dare her mother take her to America and leave her like that. And all the while, finally, something must have gave, and my grandmother, and she had come over with her kids and my grandfather, and I found it interesting because growing up, she always cooked everything from scratch and did not know how to cook out of a box. Like that was, you know. But it was weird because she did not speak good English. And she goes, I learned English from kid go to school, they come home, they teach me. So when I was very little, she would say to me, you know, you use the thing, you do this. And it was always like, win, lose, or draw. I'm like trying to think, what did she say? Broom, that's what you call it in English.
Yeah.
In Poland, you call it this. And I'm like, so she was always trying to teach me Polish, but my father said, no, we live in America.
Yeah, learn English.
So he was really against it. The girls would speak Polish to my grandmother, and all the boys were like, nope, they'd speak English, and it drove my grandmother nuts.
Yeah.
Just interest in the cultures. And,
I mean, one side of my family would speak French and the other side Italian when we got together. And like at Christmas time, they would be talking about presents and in front of us, but in French or Italian. And like, we could figure out enough stuff to kind of figure it out. Yeah, and my grandfather, eventually, he ended up owning, ultimately, an Italian, like, pasta bakery shop in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I would go in the summer, because Atlantic City was, like, a really cool touristy boardwalk, Atlantic City Beach, all this stuff was, like, a really big deal. And even when I was little, he would put me to work. So like I knew how to stuff ravioli, like put filling in cannoli, do all these things, right? And my grandfather, kind of like the way you described, very old school, still a lot of Italian. He would pretend he didn't understand, but he actually did. So you could tell, because if you talk crap about him, like he would immediately like, okay. And so when I got older, when I was like 13 or 14, I was studying some like child labor in America, right? And in the summer, I went down there and I had made out a list of how many hours I had worked for him since I was 4. And I took just the minimum wage and I did all the math and I gave him a bill. And he basically looked at me and said, you best be moving on. That took care of that. And only, you know, much later I got the drip. I mean, I really like was very, I thought like, you've exploited me. And he said, you're here, aren't you? And that was, pardon?
Isn't that what relatives are for?
Yeah, no, especially kid relatives, right? Yeah. My grandfather on the French-Canadian side was the same. I would cut his lawn, and he only wanted his lawn cut a certain way. If you didn't cut it in the pattern he wanted it cut in, he would come out and, like, whatever. And the same way when I got a little older. Like, you should be paying me to do this. He's like, you come up here on Sunday and watch my color TV, right? That's your payment. You want to see the Beatles on Ed Sullivan? Then shut up and cut the lawn. So yeah, I mean, like, there's all these, right? I mean, I think that we all, like, can reminisce these stories, which I think is great. But anyway, other thoughts, other ideas? Oh my God, okay. Go right here, then we'll come there.
Yeah, so I had two questions. First of all, what's the course you teach at the University of Lowell? What's the course?
So I teach U.S. history courses, I teach labor history courses, and I teach immigration history courses.
Okay. And
All of those things.
yeah, so I was wondering, you talked about people going to Ellis Island to kind of, I guess, traffic people here.
Yep.
But was there also some kind of push in Poland? Were they, you know, besides, I'm assuming that people sent information back to their relatives, but
Yep.
was there also a push for them to
Yes.
get rid of people from Poland?
So early on, like in the 1890s, when lots of people start leaving,
Poland at the time.
eventually, but the Polish government and other countries where people are leaving from are trying to stop people.
Okay.
For the longest time, they're trying to stop people because they don't want a shortage of people.
Yeah.
Because that will drive up.
I'd actually heard from my parents at one point that both of their fathers, because all of my grandparents came from Poland, that both of their fathers, one of the reasons they came here was to avoid the draft.
Yeah. If you came around 1910 from that part of the world, you were probably escaping being drafted into the Russian army by the Tsar. And families would send their kids. 14, 15 years old, they would send them, basically.
The Austrian army too, because
Yep.
my grandparents actually came
Yep.
from the Austrian.
Yeah, yep. So yeah, definitely. And industry would recruit, so it was not unusual for big factories to, at places where immigrants might, like where people would purchase tickets and such, that there would be billboards and posters and things, come to Chicago, you know, the weather's fine, it's never cold, there's no wind, and you can make a lot of money, right? Stuff like that. And they would do the same. There are incredible posters you can find in the Library of Congress of like parts of like Nebraska, Iowa, places like that. They were trying to draw immigrants, and they would show like these trees, orange trees, right, with oranges bigger than a human head, and like watermelons that were like this big, and like stuff like come here, and there would be also on those posters like trees with money hanging off the trees, right? And so yeah, there was, and that became, that in the laws that basically got put in place prior to the quota, that became illegal. Like putting up those kind of recruitment posters. Because the other thing that would happen is companies would go and buy people a ticket. And so you could have from a village somebody like very entrepreneurial going and recruiting 100 Polish workers to come work at Uniroyal, let's say. And then when they got here, they basically owed the ticket, but they never quite knew what the ticket actually cost. And so people basically, in the investigations people did, they realized that employers, well, gee, surprise, some employers were swindling people and saying, well, the ticket was $40, right? So you owe me this much money out of your pay for the next 5 years. And so people could be recruited, people could be, in immigration history, the way people think about it, they say there are push factors and pull factors. Some things are happening in places that are basically pushing people to leave. And then where people end up is the pull, like what's happening. And so America, again, because of the Industrial Revolution and the expanding economy and the movement of the country west. I mean, we haven't even talked at all about immigration on the West Coast, but there's massive Chinese immigration on the West Coast to mine gold and build the railroads. And then there's really horrific history of what happens to those populations. Again, it's outside of what we're doing, but when I talk with my students, that obviously in 14 weeks I can cover a lot more than an hour and a half. But so yeah, could be any number of things. I saw hands here. I think we got time for a couple more. Go ahead.
Who's doing the main tracking now of the number of immigrants that are being sent back in horrible, or sent to horrible conditions in our country? Because of so many institutions in our country that have been closed, who's doing the main tracking of what's happening to these so-called illegal immigrants?
So in theory, Homeland Security.
They don't exist anymore. So they've been closed.
Well, within that orbit, right? I mean,
But there's never going to be proper, I mean, who's checking?
no.
to see what-
I mean, and there hasn't been for I mean, actually, going back to President Obama, there's been, extradition, huge numbers of people in the Obama administration too. And there's not, like, there are kid separations from Donald Trump's first administration. There are still kids that have never been reunited with their parents from being separated in 2020. In 2019 and 2018. So yeah, we've not done a very good job at all trying to figure any of that out. The big difference was that when, if you can go and look at the data, and when President Obama was doing it, it was much more, his policies were much more targeted to not let people in the first place. And so the Obama administration numbers are actually, depending on how you think about all of this, but are good at not letting people in the first place. So he took the position that once people get here, it's much more disruptive to try to figure out what to do, so just let's not let people in. And let's do a better job not letting people in. The thing about what he did was, he didn't brag about it. He didn't go on TV and say, yeah, look what I'm doing. He just did it, right? But I think if people knew, they might have been more upset at him. In retrospect, I think people, as historians are going to start to write that history, there'll probably be more of a conversation about about all of these things, right? But as for, I have students on student visas, tons of students in my classes on student visas, and they've been told by the university not to go home for the summer because they have no way of predicting whether, like some of them are going to be a senior next year and they want to go home and see their parents and grandparents and sisters and brothers, whatever. They've been told not to go home because you might not be able to come back. And so you'll have spent 3 years here, or like doctoral students that are this close to a PhD in chemistry or physics or something like that and not go home. Basically, or if you go home, the jury's out on what might or might not happen to you. And so I'm sure UMass Amherst is going to be seriously impacted by a drop in the numbers of international students that enroll in the fall. And that's a huge hit on the budget because international students, as my chancellor likes to say, pay full freight. They don't get the mass discount. And so if you lop off even a few hundred international students, you've really done some major damage to the budget. Never mind the grant money and the other things that we're not, UMass Lowell's not, we have 20,000 students. We're a Research One university and all that, but we're not as huge as Amherst. But we've had money cut that funds grad students. And so yesterday we got a memo from the chancellor that unless you have full money to cover a grad student fellowship, you can't have them come. And the UMass Medical Center in Worcester basically just canceled its first-year program for med students because so much of the budget money was cut. So they admitted a class of about 40 prospective physicians who all got a letter and were incredibly excited. Their dream was here, right? And then a few weeks later, they got another letter saying, yeah, sorry, can't come. And they canceled the entire class. So that's really, you know, in the mix of things, if that's happening, which it probably is at a lot of med schools, we have a shortage of doctors as it is. So if we're basically canceling out, like, you know, several classes of people, that's a pretty, it has serious implications further down the road. So yeah, it's, I mean, in this period when all this was happening, it was still fairly easy to skirt the law if you wanted to. I mean, because there weren't the methods of numerical control and computers and logbooks and record keeping, and so there still were lots of people who came, particularly from French-speaking Canada. Like Lowell had a massive French-Canadian population. There was a whole area of the city that was called Little Canada, and everything in it was French. There was a French language hospital. I have students whose grandmothers and grandfathers were born in the French language hospital. And that hospital was so determined that everything would be in French that they even brought nurses and doctors from Quebec. If you couldn't speak French, you didn't deliver a baby. And that neighborhood thrived until the 1960s, before it was urban renewed off the planet. But if you were, in the 1960s when they took it down, if you were in your 50s and 60s, chances were really good, to the point that was made a bit earlier, you hadn't learned English. Your kids had, but you could get by in Little Canada. French language radio programs, French language church, you basically could just as easily be in Quebec. Which is fascinating, because then the other struggle is people who don't know the history will then say, well, why didn't they learn English? And you know, I feel like saying, well, why didn't your grandmother? You know, I don't want to have that fight. I don't want to be a punk. But it's, you know, we sort of forget the, I mean, I've done, for this book I'm doing, I've done over 100 oral histories with all different people, and like Lithuanian immigrants in Lowell, and, you know, like runs the gamut. Now it's Southeast Asian, huge Southeast Asian population in Lowell, and the stories all end up being somewhat similar. There's a certain thing that's just enough different, and it shouldn't be minimized, but there's so much that depending on your story, we share with the contemporary. If we could just figure that out, and try to figure out how to be more empathetic. But it's really, obviously, these are really difficult times that we're in, right? So, but I have students who are worried. I do work, it's time to go, I know, but I do work in Lowell every other Wednesday with a second grade class in Lowell. I work with the kids on reading and writing. I help them write little histories of the neighborhoods they live in. And they publish them, and then we have a book party. So I've done this for this is my third year doing this, every other Wednesday. And I talked to the principal the other day, and he said school attendance is way off because parents are afraid to bring their kids to school because immigration could be there. And even though he says, well, I don't know who's who and what's what, I'm assuming most people are here legally, but whether they are or they aren't, that they're afraid to drop off their kid at school is like a bridge too far. But he said attendance is just like staggeringly off. In the high school as well, kids just don't go. They're afraid of they've seen enough on the news and they've read enough and heard enough. And so again, whatever we think about all of the legalities, illegalities, or whatever, there has to be a better way. This is just not, this can't succeed in the end, and it's just going to cause even more pain and suffering needlessly for just so many people. But when little kids aren't going to school because their parents are afraid to drop them off, we've got like, there's something decidedly wrong. Again, whatever we think about these bigger, more cosmic questions, little kids shouldn't be afraid to go to school, no matter what, right? Anyway, I'm good, we're done.